In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint black and white from one tube of paint. Welcome to the watercolour workshop. We're going to be using Payne's grey, a red and a yellow. We've got a medium sized round brush and a small round brush. So the first thing to do is wet the areas of the painting that we want to be white, which in the case of this puffin is the chest and the belly and the face. I'm wetting it over the clean water on the medium sized brush, which is a size 8 in this case. And on my palette I've squozen out some Payne's grey, and then I've taken some of it and put it into a separate well, and I've watered it right down so that it's a really weak value, and I'm just dropping it into the wet area of the belly and the chest. As you can see, I am barely painting and just transferring the very wet paint onto the very wet paper by touching the brush to the paper. Some of the areas I linger a little bit to get a stronger value, more paint in there, particularly under the wing and the tail. But for the most part, I'm just going around the edge of the wetted area, leaving the central section unpainted or white, the white of the paper. Little flip with some clean water there to get a little bit of texture in. Most of that will disappear because it's all very wet at the moment. Decided that was a bit too wet, dabbing it up with a bit of tissue. So my aim here is to get a very light colour to represent the white of the bird's body and face. Now it's still damp at this point. I'm still using the Payne's grey, but this is a stronger value. This is a little marking under his chin. I thought that was a little bit too dark. So I've wet my brush, cleaned and wet it. I'm just sucking up some of the wet paint. Now onto the beak. There's an area of dark on the beak. So again, it's Payne's grey. Quite a strong value here. Still very wet, but now we're wet on dry. So the paper of this section is dry. So we've got a good amount of control. It's not going to spread around. I want to get a nice even coat. And then I clean my brush, dried it off so it's damp. I just lift a section out, the top and the bottom of the bill, to get a slightly lighter and a slightly greyed effect. Now we're going into the black section. So we've done the white, we're doing the black. And I'm going into the section of the palette where the paint is almost neat, straight from the tube. I'm only wetting the brush when I'm struggling to move the paint, so it's almost neat paint straight out of the tube. And now obviously we're getting a very dark value. So I'm going to paint this as minimally as I can. By that I mean I don't want to apply stroke, stroke, stroke. I just want to apply one stroke if I can. Because the paper is dry, I'm getting this broken effect where the little white speckles left behind. That could be splashes of water on the back of the bird. Could be some reflected light on his feathers. I'll end up covering most of them. in the end. But it's worth bearing in mind if you want that sparkly effect. Even if your paint is wet like this is, you can drag it over a dry surface and still get a little bit of white left behind. Still on the medium brush. If you're a beginner, you might want to swap to a small brush at this point. But if you've got some good brush control, you can use a medium or even a large brush, because these round brushes taper to a fine point. You can still get very fine details with them. But now I have swapped to the smaller brush to do the eye, the centre of the eye that is, and the little markings above and below the eye. These are just basic shapes of circles, oblongs, and triangles. So you need to be careful and paint them in as best you can. Notice I've moved the palette out of the way while I do that. Now, a little trick that I learned a while ago to paint fine lines. You can use a rigger brush, of course. I'll show you on the scrap of card. I ripped off a little piece of the card, painted along the edge of it, and then I use it as a stamp to stamp onto the paper. There you go. Nice, straight, clean line. Mine's got a slight kink in it at the end, never mind about that. There I'm using the damp, clean brush to lift a little bit of paint out of the, is that the forehead or the nose? I'm not sure what you call that. And now, I make a mistake here. Don't do this on your painting. I'm trying to put some hairs along the bottom of the bird. I'm looking at my reference source, and it's got little hairy legs, and that's what I'm trying to get here. But I'm going in way too thick with this dark colour. Now my intention was to scratch some of it out with a stick, but I've just come way too thick here. The benefit of hindsight. Well, I'm actually scratching it with the bottom of the brush. But I put way too much black on, and that causes me problems later on, as you will see. So don't do that if you're following along. I also forgot to draw this little yellow bit on his face. It's actually a hinge to allow the beak to open wide. I forgot to do it all together, so I just had to paint it freehand. So I've used the yellow, and then I've mixed a little bit of the red in to make an orange, or a yellowy orange. Now I'm wetting around the dark area of the bill. In reality, this is a very pale yellow. So I am mixing up my yellow to be a very light value and just dropping it into that wetted area. You've got to be careful here, because if the black area is wet, if you get the wet, dark value and yellow together, you'll end up with a green. So you need to be sure that the black is dry. And now I'm doing the bill, the beak. It's an orange colour to start with, and then I strengthen it with some red. So I'm dropping red, wet into the damp orange colour. Now I'm going with a slightly drier but still wet red value, orange red value, to carefully paint around the eye. I wouldn't recommend painting over your palette like I'm doing. That's purely for filming purposes. You'll end up with paint all over your sleeve, which is why I always wear an old sweater when I'm painting. Now I'm putting a little bit of Payne's grey into the red, and then dropping it into the lower section of the bill. These colours are all being picked up from my reference photo, which you can't see, but you can always get your own from the web somewhere. And then I'm painting the dark line using the Payne's grey, and the damp brush I'm lifting a little bit of the red out of the beak to give some lighter stripes. This is all to give texture and interest onto the bill. Now I've got my little scrap of card again. Rather than paint, and I'm just dipping it straight into the Payne's grey. And we're going to paint a little line that goes down the bill, separating the upper and lower mandible. And there you go. It's a very easy way of getting a straight line if you don't have a rigger brush, or even if you do have a rigger brush. It's possibly an easy way of doing it. Okay, a little bit of detail on the hinge and dab it off some tissue. So now it's the next day and it's dry and I'm redoing the black areas. It dried a little bit patchy and I wasn't happy with it. So it's fine to do a second layer if your first layer doesn't work out the way you want it. Sometimes you can get a good dark layer in one coat, sometimes you might have to do two. There on the wing, the edge of the wing, the shoulder if you like, I'm using the damp brush onto the dry bit to lift it off, to give myself a little bit of a texture and a little bit of a highlight. And there I've got a wet brush and I'm just dragging it into the dry paint, re-wetting it and dragging it onto the white bit. So now I'm painting the feet. I've mixed up a warm yellow. I'm not doing too much on this at the moment. Slightly warmer orange value there, and then I'm lifting out the toe ridges. You can see those shocking hairy bits on the legs there. A little bit of highlighting on the feet. I always tell myself I'm not going to get caught up in areas like this, but I always do. So there I'm using the bigger brush to put in the very fine details of the claws, because they do have a good point on them. Now I'm trying to lift out the black areas I was talking about before. I'm really struggling because, well, some paints just don't lift out as well as others. It depends on your paper. Some papers lift out better than others. And it depends on the tinting strength of the paint. Some paints will stain the paper more than others and more difficult to lift out. So I guess the lesson to learn is don't go in too dark to start with. These things happen, and this is why watercolour is a practice. You practice, sometimes you get it wrong, so you go again and try again and try and get it right next time. We'll just live with it for this time. So I'm just reinforcing some of the very, very light areas. I felt like the white was just too white, it was virtually non existent. So I'm just putting in some extra tone, and now I'm dry brushing a little bit, damp brushing I suppose it is, across the breast there to give a bit more texture, flicking on a bit of clean water, just dab up a couple of splashes. Forgot to paint the eye, so I'm going back in with that. Or I probably didn't forget, I probably waited for it to dry. Wait for the red bit and the black bit to dry. Paint it in, try and get a nice even coat. If you've got one spot that's darker than the other, like a bead of paint like I have there, you can just dry off your brush and then pick it back up with your damp brush. And I thought I needed a little bit more in this area to give myself a little bit of shading, to give some form to the head. It's meant to be a round shape, isn't it? So it needs to have shading top and bottom, so the central section is more spherical in appearance. Right, apologies for the lack of quality here. I had to use a different phone. My main phone ra- ran out, and I had to carry on with my backup phone, which isn't as good definition. But what I'm basically doing now is reinforcing or reoranging the feet. I put a little white. This is watercolour white. Didn't show that at the beginning, but that's just watercolour white. It's an optional step on his eye. With the damp brush again, lifting out some more red on the beak, just to get that little bit of detail. So these are just fine tuning at the end, which I tend to do the next day. Here's some other that I've painted. I've practiced this. I've demoed this Puffin a few times. So obviously I've got a few practice pieces, and you can see that every time it's slightly different colours, slightly different details. This one's got violet on it. I'm trying to point out it's not that visible. On this one, I went a bit crazy on this one. Did a few lines with the card, stamping with the card. So thank you for watching. I hope you found that useful, and you'll join me again soon for another watercolour workshop.